In this way, therefore, spirit is self-knowing spirit. It knows itself. That which is object for it is, or its picture thought is, the true absolute content. As we saw, it expressed spirit itself. It is at the same time not merely the content of self-consciousness and not merely object for it, but it is also actual spirit. This is because it runs through the three elements of its nature. The movement through its own phases constitutes its actuality. What moves itself, that is spirit. It is the subject of the movement, and equally the moving itself, or the substance through which the subject moves. The notion of spirit, which had emerged for us as we entered the sphere of religion, that is, as the movement of self-certain spirit which forgives evil, and in so doing abandons its own simple unitary nature and rigid unchangeableness, or as the movement in which what is in an absolute antithesis recognizes itself as the same as its opposite. This recognition bursting forth as the affirmative between these extremes, this notion is intuitively apprehended by the religious consciousness to which the absolute being is revealed and which overcomes the difference between itself and what it intuitively apprehends. Just as it is subject, so also it is substance, and hence it is itself spirit, just because and insofar as it is this movement. Paragraph 786 is the penultimate paragraph in the penultimate portion of Hegel's Phenomenology. That means it's the second to last paragraph in the second to last portion of the entire work. We've got one more gigantic, very packed paragraph yet to go to finish out the entire religion section and then move on to absolute knowing, which concludes the work. And so, we're getting to the end of religion itself. We should have a solid conception of what all this religion stuff was supposed to be about and where we're going next. And paragraph 786 does not disappoint because there's a lot of stuff going on in this seemingly, short paragraph. There's a lot that's packed in there and in multiple ways. So let me signal one of these ways right off the bat. If you've been watching this series, you know that every once in a while I get on Miller's case, the translator of the edition of the Phenomenology in English that we're using right now, because occasionally the choices that he's made as a translator could be slightly misleading. And this paragraph, unfortunately, is quite full of those sorts of occasions. So I'm going to have to point those out as we go through. None of them are damning. It's not as if Miller is mistranslating something as its opposite or as something completely unrelated, but you could get a couple mistaken impressions. So that's topic one. Topic two is that, we're moving towards the end of this work. Religion for Hegel is something that is incredibly important. Spirit takes place through it, and religion is sort of like philosophy. I won't even say light, but philosophy through representational Vorgestellte structures, terms, comportments. It's not yet philosophy. It's not yet absolute knowing, but it's getting pretty close. And so what's happening here in this paragraph is, the accumulation of all these things that we've gone through before and getting us there, you could say, metaphysically and morally, in terms of revealing what religion was supposed to be about. Then the third main thing is that we can say that there's considerable backward reference or allusions to what's been going on within the work as a whole. We saw just in the previous paragraph there was a reference to the unhappy consciousness, this important section of the consciousness or self-consciousness section, which then leads into the entire massive reason portion of the work. And we shouldn't leave that behind because that's still lingering in the background, this idea of God itself, God himself being dead, and the meaning of this death is coming through into this from the previous paragraph. But there's also a reference in here, a very interesting and kind of enigmatic reference to what was going on in the beginning of this religion section, right? He says, the notion of spirit which had emerged for us as we entered the sphere of religion, and as it's going to turn out, that's not exactly what's going on the way he's describing it as we move into the beginning of the religion section. Some of that's actually seemingly reverberating into it from the previous developments in the spirit section. So again, we got a lot going on here, a lot to unpack, and there is some really interesting advance being made here in this short paragraph. So he says, he begins it by saying, in this way, therefore, also, right, spirit is self-knowing spirit. Now, he actually says that spirit is sich selbst wissender. So it's not that it's self-knowing spirit, it is that this is what spirit is, sich selbst. So not just sich wissender, but sich selbst, knowing itself, knowing what it is, right? This is an achievement that has been attained. And we're going to see this same sich selbst formulation showing up a little bit later in the paragraph when we've got this locution, durch sich selbst hindurch. So we'll come back to that in a moment. And what does this mean? He tells us, now here's Miller's translation. It knows itself, that which is object for it is, or its picture thought is the true absolute content, right? So now, interestingly, in the punctuation, in the German text, the semicolon is placed in a somewhat different spot, right? It knows itself that which is object for it. It knows itself that, weiß sich, das, something being the case. And I kind of wonder here if maybe we shouldn't choose to translate the sich here in a kind of reflexive way, turning this into it knows not itself, it knows for itself. Es weiß sich, it knows to itself, for itself. It knows in a more thorough way that, and then we've got these two things. So what is object Gegenstand for it, right? What is opposed to it, what is standing in front of it for it is, has being, exists, right? So it knows itself that the object is. Then more importantly, its picture thought, Vorstellung, is the true, treu, right? Wahre, absolute content, Inhalt. So it's the Vorstellung, the picture thought, the representation, the imagination, the thing that's shared among the community, the narrative of what we just had in the previous paragraph, the incarnate God-man dying, the meaning of that death, with the scope of it within the community, all of that stuff that we've had in the previous paragraphs, the overcoming of evil as a result. All of this is true, wahre, absolute content. It's not absolute being, it's not absolute knowledge, it's absolute content. Content that has to have a form. But insofar as it's content, it's true and it's absolute. Now, this is something rather extraordinary for Hegel to be saying about representation or picture thought, Vorstellung, right? But it figures into what we just saw in the previous paragraph, where it's not as if picture thought has been radically thrown away. This isn't some sort of, let's get away from images and words, mysticism, man. No, it's not. That's not what's going on at all. And we should be very careful, given that Hegel's using terminology that can be translated as intuitive, Anschauung, right? Not to lapse into some sort of new agey, everything goes kind of mysticism, because that is at antipodes of what Hegel is actually charting out for us. Hegel's not a fan of that sort of thing. So this is all very interesting, right? And this is leading us to realize, as he says, that it expressed Vorstellung, right? It expressed spirit itself. It is at the same time, he says, not merely the content of self-consciousness. I mean, that's already pretty good, right? Vorstellung is the content of self-consciousness, not merely object for it, but it is also actual, wirkliche spirit. So, Vorstellung, representation, is not being simply thrown away like a ladder that you climb up or anything like that. It's being, aufgehobenes. It's being brought in. It's being sublated. It's being transcended. It's being superseded, right, into absolute, actual spirit. And Hegel goes on then, and he says something that's a little bit enigmatic when we look at the text itself, right? He says, this is because it runs through the three elements of its nature. Now, runs through durchlaufen, right? Okay, so it runs through these three elementa of its nature, and he says the movement through its own phases constitutes its actuality. Now, there is no through its phases in the German. Instead, what we actually have is something quite interesting. Durch sich selbst hindurch, right? So we've got this durch, through, arising twice in this locution, and we've got the sich selbst of spirit, sich selbst wissender, right? Already being hearkened back to. I mean, so we've got through, and then through to the other side, or through on its way, right? Through its phases, that's kind of an interpolation, I would say there. And then constitutes, macht aus, its actuality, its Wirklichkeit, the Wirklichkeit of the Wirkliches Geistes, right? So what are these three elements? Here we got to do a little bit of reconstructive work, I would say, because Hegel doesn't say, well, the first is, the second is, the third is, and Miller is actually going to add an extra term in there. So the first thing that he says, what moves itself, sich bewegt, right? Was sich bewegt, is it, ist er. He doesn't say what moves itself, that is spirit. He says what moves itself, that is it. So, is it spirit? Yeah, all this stuff is spirit in a kind of trivial sense. Is he signifying spirit at that point? No, but he's going to be bringing it in a little bit later. So we've got the first element, what moves itself, right? And what does move itself? Well, all sorts of things that aren't dead. Living beings, thought, our relationships, history, pick whatever you want, right? And then we get the second element. It is the subject of the movement, right? He says it is the subject of the movement and is equally, here's the third, the moving itself, das Bewegen selbst. So the substance, he says, through which the subject moves. So we've got what moves itself, the subject of the movement. Now, what does it mean to be the subject of the movement? Okay, so things do move themselves, but are they subjects of that movement, or are they merely acted upon? Subject, as I mentioned in previous videos, implies a certain kind of agency, and at least in the case of human beings, a teleology, you could say, an orientation towards something. And it also involves, because we're talking about self-consciousnesses here, an awareness of their own lack and relation to other self-consciousnesses and what it is that they desire, anerkennen, recognition. There's a whole bunch of things going on here. And then we've got the moving itself, which is the substance through which the subject moves itself, right? So we've got this complicated analysis of movement or moving, Bewegung or bewegen, right? And it introduces subject and substance. And then Hegel will talk about the notion of spirit, right? So the concept, the Begriff of spirit, which had emerged for us as we entered the sphere of religion. Okay, so let's actually backtrack, and if you don't mind a little bit of digression here and going back to the actual beginning of the religion section, what do we have being discussed? So there's, quite a bit of bringing together of, hey, there were 4 previous movements, consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit, and each of these has gone through an important transition. We see a reference already in the second paragraph to the unhappy consciousness, then reason, and then discussion about the ethical world. And what we're getting are all sorts of shapes of not just consciousness or spirit, but of, prefigurations of religion, right? And then we get to the religion of morality. This is in paragraph 676. The fact that absolute being is a positive content is at last recognized. The content is bound up with the negativity of the Enlightenment, right? And then we get this discussion in 677. The self-knowing spirit is in religion immediately its own pure self-consciousness. And we go on from this again, talking about different shapes, different gestalten of consciousness, of religious being. And then in 678, I think here, and in the ones that come after it, we start to get a little bit more meat, so to speak. He says that spirit's existence is distinct from its self-consciousness. Its reality falls outside of religion. There is indeed one spirit of both, but its consciousness does not embrace both together. And religion appears as part of existence, of conduct and activity, whose other part is the life lived in the real world. And so really what we have is 2 different kinds of Wirklichkeit, actuality, religion, and then the real world, right? That religion supersedes, you could say. And so what do we got here, though? So we entered the sphere of religion, as the movement of self-certain spirit. Okay, yeah, I think we've got that going on here. Spirit has become certain of itself in some ways, right? He tells us that the genesis of religion in general is contained in the movement of the universal moments. Self-consciousness is a very important part of that. But he also tells us all we've got here is the notion, the concept, the Begriff of religion, and we have to develop it. Now, what does he tell us going back to 786? So, as we enter the sphere of religion, the movement of self-certain spirit, which does what? Forgives evil. Now, if you look in these first paragraphs at the beginning of the religion section, do you see a discussion of the forgiveness of evil? No, you will see lots of discussion of the forgiveness of evil throughout the religion section, but not so much at the beginning. But there was some discussion of this earlier in the Spirit section. So what is Hegel actually signifying to us here? Is he saying that's what was really being addressed, discussed? I just didn't call it as such. That's one possible read of this. But let's see where he's going here. What happens when it forgives evil? It abandons its own simple unitary nature and rigid unchangeableness. Right? So it is developing. It's becoming more complex in relation to us human beings who have religion, who comport ourselves religiously, who orient ourselves to what the unhappy consciousness called the beyond, to the God that is now engaged with us, and not just in absolute or revealed religion, right? But already in the other earlier shapes of religion, particularly in the religion as a work of art section, right? And the cult. So he goes on and he tells us, as the movement in which what is in an absolute antithesis. Okay, so religious consciousness is realizing this notion of spirit. How so? Through the movement of self-certain spirit forgiving evil. Great. But what else do we have? A movement which is an absolute antithesis, in which what is in an absolute antithesis recognizes erkannt, or Kent, rather, right? So knows itself, recognizes, works for that. This is not anerkennen, right? This is erkennen. So it's not quite the same thing as like recognition with a capital R, that spirit or us is desiring, right? But there is a recognition here. What is in an absolute antithesis recognizes itself as the same as its opposite. All right, so what do we have here? Absolute antithesis, absolute entgegengesetzte. And it's das entgegengesetzte. So that's singular. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's one thing here that is in an absolute antithesis with itself. It recognizes itself as the same as its opposite. Now, as its opposite, not in the German there. Sich als dasselbe erkennt. Right? It recognizes itself, right, as the same, as having opposition within it, and as being the same as that opposition. That's a good way to frame it there. And so he says that this recognition bursts forth as the affirmative. And the affirmative there is just a yes. It doesn't have to be quite so wordy as affirmative between these extremes. Now, here is where he says, this notion, this concept, is intuitively apprehended. Okay, it's not intuitively apprehended. It is, what we have here is anschauen. It sees it. It grasps it. You could say intuitively, but don't make an appeal to a faculty of intuition, or try to equate conceptual thought with anschauen or intuition, because that's not what Hegel's doing here. It realizes it. It grasps it, right? By the religious consciousness to which the absolute being is revealed, Offenbar, right? And we've been dealing with the revealed religion here. And then he goes, which overcomes the difference between itself and what it intuitively apprehends. Again, anschauen, right? So the difference between itself, what is doing the looking on, and what is looked upon, what is being grasped. We have a unity in difference here, right? And not a big surprise, because Hegel's all about that all the time, right? When things aren't being split apart and put into antithesis with each other. Now, here he is going to conclude by bringing in one more really important thing, bringing this paragraph to a close and getting us ready for the final paragraph of the religion section. Just as it is subject, it is also substance. So, okay, we've got that already here in this movement through its phases, right? Subject and substance. And hence, it is itself spirit, just because and insofar as it is this movement. So we see these three moments or elements brought back together in the last thing. And what we've got here is something that is spirit and substance and subject and, of course, self and self-consciousness all coming together in a crux. And now we're ready to finish up with the religion section.